Good morning, Ms. Kelly. I am Andie Anderson. I am going to be your evaluator for this observation. Thank you for meeting with me. Before we get started, I'd like to just start by spending some time talking about your upcoming lesson and your planning process and anything I should expect to see. So let's start. Well, before we start, do you have any questions for me?
Nope, I'm just excited to kind of share what we're going to do and collaborate. And yeah.
So let's start by talking about your learning goals. What is the overall goal for this lesson and how is it aligned with your TEKS?
Yeah. So we're going to be doing the seven principles of the US Constitution. So looking at how the framers limited government while still protecting liberty. Our learning target is that students, I can explain the seven constitutional principles and evaluate how they continue to influence the United States government today. Success criteria is identifying all seven principles, analyzing primary source excerpts, applying the principles to historical and modern examples, justifying reasoning using evidence from the Constitution. So the primary goal for the students is I want them to be able to move beyond just simply memorizing the seven constitutional principles and rather being able to develop kind of more of a conceptual understanding of how these principles continue to shape our government today. So, kind of going from just like I can name them to, well, what does that look like today? I really want students to recognize that the Constitution isn't just like an 18th century document, it's a living framework and it influences decisions that they hear about in the news today. So the lesson is connected to the TEKS. The U.S. History TEKS require students explain the principles reflected in the Constitution, such as popular sovereignty, republicanism, federalism, separation of power, checks and balances, limited government, and individual rights. So I want to kind of move past in my lesson just asking students to memorize those definitions of what it is and really analyze those and provide examples from both the Constitutional Convention as well as like contemporary governments. Like, where do we see republicanism? How are you involved in that? Or, the people around you. My objective is that by the end of class, students should be able to identify which constitutional principle is being demonstrated, explain why, and then defend their reasoning using evidence. Just kind of really emphasizing on the analysis and justification so that we're moving students beyond just that recall into that more higher order and depth of knowledge thinking, which is where I would like them to be able to operate for most of the lesson.
Sounds like a really lofty goal, and definitely I can see the application to, the real world and the world around our kids, which is kind of those connections we want them to be able to make.
Mhm.
So, in thinking about your lesson, what really led you to design your lesson that way?
Yeah, something. I think just from teaching it in the past, I noticed that students often treat like the vocabulary in government just kind of as a unit. They tend to just like memorize the definitions and move on. But they're struggling to recognize how those same principles, like in more authentic situations. Um, so started with designing the lesson backwards from the application I wanted to see. So instead of just beginning with like notes or worksheets, you're just like jumping into like a direct teach. Students are going to start by examining a political cartoon depicting the branches of government. They're going to start discussing what they notice and what they think is happening. So getting that collaboration, conversation, kind of some Kagan structures in there. From there, I would like to provide just enough direct instruction to establish kind of a common understanding of like what are we seeing, what do we notice before we shift the responsibility fully onto the students through collaboration and inquiry. So the role for me as a teacher is kind of become more of a facilitator while students are working to construct the meaning around them.
Mm.
I think that by going by this approach, it can help students kind of reflect how historians think of kind of looking at the information provided for them using that inquiry. So our historians are always analyzing evidence. They're discussing, debating, creating interpretations to justify their conclusions. And so providing students that opportunity to kind of put that historian hat on. I also want students doing the work instead of just listening to me lecture for 45 minutes. So I want it to be more of collaboration, student led, with, the teacher helping facilitate conversations as needed, but really allowing students to lead those conversations.
I really like how you're focusing on like that backwards design aspect of it and knowing where you want the kids to go before you start just throwing content at them. So, moving into thinking about your activities and materials, and also kind of your assessment piece, talk to me about your activities and how you're sequencing that.
Yeah, perfect. So using that backwards design, being really intentional too of like what's the end that I want. Organizing the lesson using kind of that gradual release model of kind of like we do, I do, me do. So we're going to begin with kind of just a bell ringer where students are going to analyze that political cartoon related to checks and balances to help activate their prior knowledge as well as engaging them in that historical thinking. Next, providing about 10 minutes or so of direct instructions, introducing those 7 principles using visuals and examples. Then students are going to go through a collaborative learning station. And so they're going to kind of revolve around that. So each station's going to have something different. So one contains excerpts from the Constitution, which is, our primary source. Another contains historical scenarios from the Constitutional Convention. Another asks students to analyze Supreme Court cases. One station focuses on current events, so where students identify constitutional principles and action. So making that connection to what the principle is, what does that principle look like when it's actively working. And then students will complete an individual exit ticket. Let me go back one. So they're doing those stations, and then as they're going through and discussing, they have to defend their thinking while citing evidence. So it's important for them to be able to use the sources that they have, their prior knowledge, to kind of justify their analyzing of it. Then they'll do their individual exit ticket, which is going to ask them to analyze a modern government situation and explain which constitutional principle is most evident. So each activity is intentionally building towards that final demonstration of understanding.
So when you were thinking about these stations, how did you determine like time limits and how much time each activity should receive?
Yeah, so I think with teaching this subject for so many years, it's just something that I've adjusted over time. Also kind of knowing where my students are currently at kind of adjust the time as well. So some students don't really need more lecture. I think when teaching the government section, they need a little bit more collaboration, real world examples and those inquiry, or else it can be very dry. So instead of just lectures, they need kind of more of that processing time. So about 20% of the lesson is teacher directed instruction, whereas about 80% is really revolving around students engaging in reading, discussions, collaboration, writing, and analyzing. But you can build flexibility into that lesson. And then as students are working that allows me as a teacher to kind of facilitate, and I can give more support to students or groups that maybe need more support while also providing enrichment or challenge. I think through the years, what I've noticed is students are having rich academic conversations at one station. I'm comfortable like extending that time and shortening another activity because I would rather really focus on that authentic learning. So if students are in it and really going further and deeper, we can shorten something else. There's no need to be like, well, we got to like move on because of time. So allowing for that authentic learning rather than sticking really rigid to a schedule.
Okay. I like the willingness to like monitor and adjust as the students are
Yeah.
building into it. And so when you're thinking about your progression throughout your unit, how does this lesson build from the previous learning that students have done?
Yeah. So in our previous lesson, we completed a review of the Articles of Confederation. So students have previously just learned that our first government, the Articles of Confederation, was intentionally set up to be weak and it was ineffective. It was intentionally set up that way because of the fear of, tyranny. And we just finally won independence from Great Britain. So we don't want to give opportunities for that. However, it lacked certain things that and structures needed in order for the country to like successfully function. So they kind of have that pre-learning of the Articles of Confederation failed, intentionally weak, ultimately ineffective. What did we do next? So if the Articles of Confederation didn't work, what did the framers create instead is kind of where we're at. So the constitutional principles were discussed addressing those weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So students study federalism. They're recognizing that the power is now shared rather than concentrated. I always like to teach it as like a power sandwich. And then as they're learning about checks and balances, they're understanding why the framers wanted to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful, right? We have that big fear of like a king, a monarchy, tyranny. So how do we balance it to where no one group, no one person gets all that power? So we have this historical progression that is making the Constitution more meaningful because students are understanding the why behind the principle. So like, why would we put in popular sovereignty? What does that fix from Articles of Confederation, from our time being under England's rule? Why do we have republicanism? So kind of learning about, well, we're doing this because of this. So kind of like the cause, here's the effect of that.
And so if that's where you're coming from, how does this lesson prepare students for their future learning?
Yeah, so I think the foundation for the rest of our instruction is the years as we have to discuss many landmark changes and movements. I think it just kind of sets the building block of understanding the why this has happened. Because this has happened, we now have this to prevent this. So over our next several units, we will review and apply the Bill of Rights. So looking at landmark Supreme Court decisions, looking at federal powers, civil liberties, constitutional amendments. Students can't really analyze important cases like Brown versus Board of Education or Tinker versus like Des Moines unless they understand the constitutional principles that those decisions are based upon. So we're going to continue revisiting today's concepts of those 7 principles of government throughout the year and seeing like, hey, here's where that checks and balances is playing in. Here's where that separation of power is playing in, or here's that checks and balances. So rather than it being like an isolated lesson, it's really one piece of the bigger puzzle, the bigger storyline of the evolution of American democracy.
So I'm seeing that this is kind of one of those foundational pieces that students really need to understand in order to be successful going forward. So in that case, in thinking about your assessment piece, how are you going to know if your students are meeting the objective during the lesson?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the assessment piece and collecting data is something that I'm continuously working on. Especially, how am I collecting those data throughout the lesson rather than just at the very end? So for me, students are going to row through those stations. This is where I can get some formative data. Where I'm going to document like what are common misconceptions I'm hearing. I can ask intentional probing questions, as well as noting students who are demonstrating mastery or students who it's like, ooh, we're really struggling with the vocabulary and its application. How can I provide some more support? Using whole group check-ins for understanding throughout the lesson, as well as students participating in some quick polls, partner discussion, and brief written responses that can help me gauge understanding before moving on. Exit ticket, though, I think gives me kind of the clearest picture of individual mastery because students have to independently do that and apply what they've learned to a new scenario. So I think that data then determines my next day's instruction of what is it that we need to review. What are the misconceptions? Like, where are we collectively as a whole, as well as individually, who's maybe needing more scaffolds and support?
So let's say you get to the end of the lesson and you notice that several students haven't demonstrated mastery. What are some ways that you would want to address this?
Yeah, I think going through, if I'm noticing that there's several misconceptions during the lesson, addressing those immediately through guided questioning rather than simply giving, students the answer. So rather just being like, hey, everybody's got republicanism wrong. This is what it is, providing that questioning to kind of help guide them. So like students often, I've noticed in the past, tend to confuse separation of powers and checks and balances. So instead of just like a correction outright, asking them to compare the two concepts and explain their relationship. If students continue to like struggle with that, then using that exit data to create a more flexible small grouping for the next day. I think some students, what I've noticed in the past too, is may need reteaching with more scaffolds like graphic organizers, guided examples, pictures, while others who demonstrate mastery need more of an enrichment and can move into like extension activities. So like, how does this apply to this specific example? Maybe it's a Supreme Court case or current constitutional debates, or maybe like a news current event headline. So I think my goal when students aren't getting it is really to try to provide responsive instruction and more flexible rather than just like one size fits all.
So now that I have kind of a good understanding of what your lesson is going to look like and how you're going to assess and how you're going to respond to student achievement or lack thereof, I'd like to kind of know a little bit more about your students. So when you were planning out your lesson, how did you kind of determine your instructional groups? How did you group your kids?
Yeah, so I use seating charts, but I tend to intentionally try to create like heterogeneous groups of 4 students. And it's not always just to group them strictly by ability, but providing kind of that balance teams where students can learn off of one another, because it's not helpful if I have 4 low students all together. That's everybody drowning. It's not also helpful if I have 4 high students all together. So trying to create a balance as well as keeping in mind ability, what their language proficiency is, things like that. So when creating groups, I'm looking at, academic performance, classroom participation, reading ability, interpersonal dynamics. And so what I've found kind of over the years that history naturally leads itself to discussions. And so students deepen their understanding when they can talk through historical problems with one another. So I do try to create that mixed ability grouping. That way students are exposed to different perspectives, as well as can explain, concepts using language that's also like meaningful to their peers. Because sometimes I could say one thing and a student can kind of say the same thing, but in their own way. And a student is going to better understand that from their peer than from me. And then classroom relationships. Some students thrive when paired together because they can challenge one another. Some we got to have them separated or nothing's going to get done. Or it's they don't have a way of communicating with one another that's productive. So I really try to be, when grouping students, intentional and based on what I know about my students as learners as well as individuals.
I really like that.
Thank you.
So then when you're planning, how do you plan intentionally or take IEPs into consideration?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when I'm doing my planning, it's really important that I look at accessibility. I want all students, regardless of academic, language proficiency, learning disabilities, whatever it is, I want them to be able to engage and it still be rigorous, even if it's rigorous for them. So I want all students to be able to engage in the lesson and in the content in a rigorous way, even if that means different supports are gonna get them there. So students who receive special education services, I tend to have lots of accommodations that align with different individual IEPs. So some of those look like guided notes. Some is more chunked reading passages, providing extended processing time, opportunities to like verbally explain their thinking before writing it down. And then for my English language learners, providing those vocabulary supports, the visuals, sentence stems, scaffolds, collaborative discussion opportunities throughout the lesson. So given we're discussing concepts like federalism, popular sovereignty, students will have access to vocabulary reference sheets with definitions and student-friendly language. I also have like a very print-rich environment in the classroom. So looking at those anchor charts, those different posters along the room as well to provide that support. I try to be really intentional when selecting primary source excerpts that still preserve the historical language, but are short enough that like it doesn't overwhelm students, because sometimes I think in history it's really hard because the language is so different than how we talk, and it's really hard to break that down and be like, well, what is this even saying? So trying to, I think for me, is maintaining the rigor for all of my students while also removing any unnecessary barriers. So it takes some time.
Sounds like it. So, how do you take student backgrounds into consideration?
Yeah. I think this is definitely a growing part for me, just in terms of like, how am I as a teacher being culturally responsive? Just because, my class is filled with students with wide variety of experiences, interests, perspectives. So trying my best to make history relevant in their lives. One way I do this is I try to connect the constitutional principles to issues students have maybe already heard about within their communities or on social media. So instead of just like discussing federalism as this like abstract sense, examining how state and federal government share responsibilities during like natural disasters or like public health decisions. So looking at how is that shared power between the state, national government, like how are they collaborating and sharing that power to make it a little bit more concrete and less like abstract.
Mhm.
I also recognize that, like, and again, I think that's where it's kind of that learning and still building on it, is that students bring different levels of prior knowledge into the classroom. Some students have very like strong civics instructions, while others have maybe very little. Some families, that's what you talk about at the dinner table, is like the world around you. Other families, it's, we don't talk about this, or like you don't need to know about that. So I think just trying to be intentional to activate prior knowledge at the beginning of the lesson so that everyone at least has an entry point. So like natural disasters, flooding, for example, like we've living in Texas have experienced that, or we've heard of it. It's not like, well, I've never experienced that or know anything about that. So just kind of to help bring everybody to where like we all at least have like one example or one entry point. I do strive to create a classroom where like students feel comfortable sharing their perspectives respectfully, even when we discuss complex political or like historical topics. And I think that's just one that is just you have to just continue to foster, especially as those opportunities like naturally present themselves in the classroom. It's how am I fostering this in a way that doesn't shut kids down, but we can do it that's respectful and honors everybody, and their perspectives and what they bring into the classroom, and still make it educational.
So, what supports do you have available for students who are going to be struggling who might struggle during your lesson? I'm not going to assume that they
No,
will.
there's always going to be someone who's struggling. So I think it's a natural assumption. I think just continuing to monitor students' understanding throughout the instructions. That's being up and visible, listening to what kids are saying. When I notice kids are struggling, I think my first response isn't to rescue them and like give them the answer, but really kind of probe them and guide them through questionings that help them uncover the answer themselves. So like if a student is incorrectly identifying a scenario as federalism instead of separation of power, I might exact who's exercising this power in this example, or which level of government do you think is involved? And so I think those questions encourage students to think their reasoning instead of me just simply being like, no, that's wrong. Here's this. It leads them to it. If students are still struggling, though, I think I can pull small groups for additional support while the rest of the class is like working independently. Given that the lesson is station based, I think it's easier to kind of differentiate in real time without interrupting the learning of all other students.
I like that. So it does sound like the kids are going to be doing a whole lot of thinking during the lesson, but from your perspective, what kinds of thinking do you think, or do you expect students to be doing?
Yeah, I think it's going to be more analytical and evaluative. So analyzing, okay, what principle is this? How do I know that? How can I evaluate that? So it's taking it from that memorization of like, oh, we know popular sovereignty is power to the people. Okay, but like, where can I see examples and analyze like, oh, this is like popular sovereignty, like we're giving the power to the people to do this, or this is separation of powers. So comparing constitutional principles, analyzing historical evidence, evaluating scenarios. So really looking at them and having to determine, okay, which principle is this? And then how do I know that? So using evidence for their conclusion. So for example, like students may debate whether like a particular situation reflects checks and balances or separation of power. And sometimes there's not always like an obvious answer. So providing them opportunities to really justify their thinking with constitutional evidence, I think really takes it from just the memorization to the application of it. So again, it requires students to explain, defend, revise, and then sometimes even change their thinking based on evidence, hopefully. So I think that's the historical thinking we want with our young students too, is can we explain, defend, provide justification using evidence, as well as can we change our mind when more evidence has been provided?
think that's one of the things I love about history teaching is the fact that it does lead more towards discussion and defense and figuring out different perspectives. Um, so I like your plan here. Um, how do your instructional materials support all of these very lofty goals that you have made?
Yeah, so since the lesson really is less teacher led and the focus is to move from just like rote memorization to that analyzing, using evidence, I think the resources selected require students to think rather than just consume. So, like, we're giving them some kind of base information you need to know, but now we're going to practice identifying those, explaining. So, the primary sources provided help students interact directly with the Constitution instead of only on like my explanation. So seeing actual primary sources, political cartoons, providing students with, visuals, helping them to interpret symbolism, historical scenarios, ask students to connect events to constitutional principles, and then current events examples help demonstrate that the ideas are like still relevant today. Like this isn't just, well, this happened back then and then that's that. Like, no, this is still happening today. And then having technology strategically rather than just for the sake of technology. That's where students can submit that formative assessment electronically of like their exit ticket, allowing me to get kind of some direct data in terms of what misconceptions do we have before we can move forward. What do maybe collectively the lesson's gone really well and everybody's really got it. Can I provide an extension that maybe goes a little bit deeper and provides also more engagement for students?
So I like that you bring up engagement. So in thinking about your lesson, one of the struggles that might happen during station work with kids is keeping engaged in what you're supposed to be doing, even though, we know that station work is very beneficial. So how are you, or what strategies do you plan to use to keep your kids engaged throughout the lesson?
Yeah, definitely relevance. And then, so I find that, students are more invested when they're understanding like why something matters. So kind of bringing that relevance back to them. Again, rather than asking them just to memorize 7 words, framing the lessons around a bigger question. So like, how do we prevent government from becoming too powerful? And so by providing inquiry and questions like that, I think students just naturally get curious. So throughout that lesson, students are moving, discussing, analyzing, solving problems rather than like sitting passively. There is an element of productive struggle as well. So students won't receive immediate answers. They need to work through evidence collaboratively before arriving to conclusions. So I think students are more engaged when they feel like intellectually challenged but supported, while also given opportunities to collaborate and hear from their peers, and then providing that relevance.
Okay. So when you're thinking about your lesson, how does this challenge students at different levels?
Yeah, so that differentiation piece. So again, kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier of like access and rigor rather than like lowering expectations. I want to take away unnecessary barriers without necessarily lowering the expectations of what I want students to do, regardless of their abilities. So all students are working towards the same learning objectives, but again, they might see different supports to get there. So students who need additional assistance might again receive those graphic organizers, vocabulary scaffolds, maybe more frequent teacher check-in. Students who are demonstrating more mastery are going to have extension opportunities that are requiring for deeper analysis. So maybe it's examining a recent Supreme Court decision and identifying multiple constitutional principles working together rather than just one. questioning also serves as a form of differentiation. So some students may need questions that help them identify evidence, while others are ready to like evaluate competing like interpretations or like defending the constitutional argument.
Sounds like you have a plan in place and that every student is going to get challenged. So in thinking about that, let's talk about how you monitor and adjust. How will you know if you need to adjust your instruction during the lesson?
Yeah, I think it's just looking for patterns. And so if multiple groups are asking the same question or making the same mistakes, to me, that's a signal that I need to pause and address this misconception, like with the entire class. Also, listening carefully to student conversations. Sometimes students can complete a task without truly understanding it. So I think listening for their academic conversations provides richer evidence than simply just checking whether the answer is correct or not. um, Paying close attention to the pacing. If discussions are becoming superficial because students are rushing, maybe we need to slow down. If students are creating mastery quickly, I need to move them into a deeper application of the activities. So I think the instruction should always respond to students learning rather than the time on the clock.
Absolutely. So when you are checking for understanding, what are some of your favorite strategies to use?
I like to use like a variety because I don't necessarily think that like one single strategy really captures it all. So I do like some Kagan structures such as like turn and talks. I think quick writes are really helpful. Whiteboard, exit tickets, electronic polls, targeted questioning, just targeted questioning throughout the lesson. Sometimes I like to do four corners where you kind of have like four different options and get them up and moving. Um, so I think students' explanations tend to reveal the misconceptions that wouldn't appear if I only looked at whether like an answer is correct or not. Like I kind of want to look at what's the path of your thinking that's getting you to that answer, whether that answer is correct or wrong.
Okay, so let's shift to thinking about your classroom environment. How do you use routines to maximize your instructional time?
So I am very big on consistency. Like I have my structures in place and we do them every day. So students from the beginning know, like beginning of school, know what to expect when they enter the room. So I reinforce that. The bell ringer is already projected, materials are organized before class begins, and transition expectations have been practiced since the beginning of the school year. So like I'm a big stickler on that. We will stop and we will try it again to reinforce that. Because my routines are predictable, I feel like I spend very little instructional time giving directions. It's kind of this easy flow. So that helps us maximize our learning while still creating an environment where students feel comfortable taking those academic risks. But I'm also a big believer students need like routine and structure, and they thrive when they have that routine and structure. So if I'm staying on top of that, it just makes it easier for everyone.
So you mentioned the idea of creating a place that's safe for students to take risks. And so in thinking about that, how do you foster that type of classroom culture?
Yeah. Um, I mean, relationships obviously are like really big. I think you can talk to any teacher about that. What I have kind of found is that students are more willing to engage in a more rigorous discussion if they know their ideas will be respected. So I think it's really important when creating that culture, not only just as a teacher, but together with the students, is, first I'm intentionally learning about my students beyond the academics, greeting them at the door. I go to, extracurricular events when possible. Very big. If a student invites me and I can make it work with my calendar, I'm going to go. And then making it a point to just celebrate growth as much as an actual achievement. So that could literally look as like maybe a student has been failing a test and has had failing grades and we're making progress from now in the 70s, you pass the test. That's a really big deal, and we're going to celebrate that. So I think sometimes too, students often in history classes examine controversial issues. And so that can be delicate and hard. So it's really important that the classroom feels like psychologically safe. Can we, with our different perspectives and ideas and thoughts, share them in a way that is still respectful to the other human beings in our classroom, while also providing students with the opportunity to, cite sources or give evidence, as well as listen, even if maybe they don't agree, but still keeping that humanity process with it. So that requires us practicing respectful disagreements, because conflict resolution is a skill people need to have. So I would like our classroom, and I feel students know that in our classroom, it's okay to challenge ideas, but we're not going to challenge people. So it's keeping the humanity while identifying, we all have different thoughts, ideas, belief systems, perspectives that we bring into this world. How can we share that to maybe understand someone a little bit better, but never taking away that person or that human aspect? So just kind of creating an environment where thoughtful discussion can happen without students feeling that they'll be embarrassed or dismissed. And so I think that requires facilitation, fostering, um, as well as just, honest, hard conversations.
Uh, Sounds like there's a lot of intentionality behind your classroom culture. I appreciate that. My last question is really, how do you manage behavior while ensuring that we're maximizing instructional time and maintaining momentum?
So I think for me, just like my educational philosophy has always kind of been like the best classroom management begins with like obviously relationships with students, but also with engaging instruction. So when students are actively thinking, discussing, solving meaningful problems, behavior naturally decreases. So if redirection is necessary, which it happens, we're dealing with kids, I try to address it quickly and privately whenever possible so that instruction can continue uninterrupted. I'm big on like forced proximity sometimes just like standing over there can do more than me saying anything. But because we've set up those routines and those structures and they've been explicitly established and taught from the beginning of the year, most of my corrections are nonverbal. So eye contact, quick reminder. I'm big on a thumbs down. Thumbs down does so much. And that's usually all they need, or just like a tap on the desk as I walk by. So I want to pursue, or not pursue, like still preserving students, dignity while keeping the focus on learning. And then if it's something that really is taking away from our learning, having a quick private conversation. Because behavior is communication. So just doing the best.
So thank you for meeting with me. I really enjoyed hearing about the intentionality behind your planning and your classroom environment. And I'm looking forward to observing your lesson. When I'm in there, I'm going to look for some student thinking, some engagement, and some of that discourse that you've kind of described. Do you have any questions for me?
No, I appreciate you kind of walking through my lesson with me because it just kind of helps jog me. And I appreciate any feedback you can provide. One area I'm interested, like when you come in to observe, is in like student discourse. So I've been intentionally shifting more like of the load onto like students this year. So I would love to kind of see your perspective on whether like do you think students based on your observation are truly leading the learning, or is there maybe additional opportunities for me to like step back and facilitate rather than direct? So that's something I would love for you to kind of keep in the back of your head when you're observing.
I will do that. All right. So thank you for having me into your classroom today. I really enjoyed watching your lesson. Before I share any observations, I kind of just want to hear what your thoughts are, and have you kind of reflect through your process and today's lesson. So in reflecting on today's lesson, what do you think was the strongest part of it and why?
Yeah, I think overall, I feel really good about the level of students' thinking that occurred during the lesson. If I had to identify one strength, I think it'd be the quality of academic discussions that I heard during the station rotations. A moment that stood out to me during the current event stations was students were analyzing an article about disaster relief and then debating whether the example represented federalism or simply like the executive leadership branch. So rather than looking for me towards the answer, students really began referencing like their constitutional excerpts and discussing which level of government actually held the authority in that situation. And so that was just like a bright teacher moment. I noticed that that conversation lasted for like several minutes without like me intervening or anything like that. Students did a really good job being respectful while challenging each other's thinking. They did a great job citing their evidence, and then they reached consensus together, which was great. So, I mean, that's what I want my historical like instruction to look like is students weren't just memorizing it, they were acting like historians and like civic thinkers. um, I think another piece for me that this lesson went well today was our exit tickets. Most students were able to correctly identify constitutional principle, and then justify their reasoning with evidence instead of just naming like the vocabulary term. So that kind of lets me know that students are transferring their learning rather than just like recall and like isolation memorization.
I definitely think you should be proud of that teacher moment. I noticed those discussions as well. They were definitely higher order, um, definitely a lot of respectful discourse, and I definitely saw a very high level of student ownership as part of that lesson. And that's one of our school goals is to, and district goals is to build in that student ownership. So that was really great. Um, as you're thinking back on it, how did you know that students were engaged? Did you notice any students who were less than engaged? Or in thinking about it, is there anything that you might do differently next time?
Yeah, so an indicator for me is I'm looking at who's doing the talking. So during our lesson, I would estimate that about like close to 80% of the talking, um, that like students were doing 80% of the talking and then I was doing the rest facilitating. To me, that's a positive sign because it means that kind of that cognitive load is on the students rather than just on me. I also noticed students asking like one another questions instead of immediately asking for me. So that collaboration piece. I heard one student ask another student, why wouldn't this be checks and balances? Another student responded with their explanation of the differences between separation of powers and checks and balances using their constitutional evidence. So those peer-to-peer conversations tell me that students are actively processing what we're learning, and the information they're getting rather than waiting for like the teacher to confirm. And so I was also observing students were staying focused during transition, because classroom routines have been established. They were able to move between stations really quickly and begin work almost immediately without me having to reinforce that transition. That said, I mean, there were still some students who were participating less than other group members. Um, One student I know tends to process information just more internally before speaking, while another is just naturally quieter during discussions. Um, so I think next time something I maybe would do different is assign collaborative roles, such as like, hey, you're the discussion facilitator. Your job is evidence collector, recorder, or spokesperson. And then that could also change with each station that they go to, just to kind of ensure that everybody has a clearly defined responsibility, and then there's that buy-in of everybody has to talk.
So I really appreciate that reflection. I think giving those group roles is also, like as you said, it's a way to get that collective buy-in and to increase equitable participation. Um, you know, we've all done a lot of Kagan in here, and we get the hand movements. And one of the big things about engagement is that equitable participation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's something I've used before, and I think it could help strengthening the lesson. And maybe it too could be like talking chips. Everybody has 2 or 4 talking chips, and like you have to put down a talking chip.
So, thinking about student mastery of the learning objective, like to what extent do you think your kids got it? And like how did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, I think so. The majority of the students have met the objective. Specifically, looking at the exit tickets, about 85% can correctly identify those constitutional principles being demonstrated, as well as providing reasonable explanation. The remaining students weren't like completely off track. The most common misconception is confusing separation of power and checks and balances. So I think this misconception, I think it's something I expected just because they're closely related and they're kind of interconnected. Something that encouraged me, though, is that students weren't guessing randomly. Their explanations really showed their partial understanding, even if they selected the incorrect principle. So, kind of have insight into where their thinking was. So, I think tomorrow's warm up will be we will revisit those 2 concepts using a compare and contrast before we move into our next lesson. So I see today's lesson not as the end, but as like information that gives me for like our next instructional decision.
And thinking back to the pre-conference that we had, I really think that, you mentioned basically that this lesson is kind of the foundation for the future government instruction. And I think it's a really positive outcome that this is how well they're doing so that they've got that strong foundation as you go on. I also really appreciate the fact that when you're looking at your exit tickets and you're making your decisions, you're using evidence-based data rather than just assuming. And so that's a good, strong indicator of instructional quality. So let's talk about questioning. When you're reflecting back on your questions, how effective do you think they were in promoting that higher order thinking?
Yeah, I think I had some strong questions. I think my strongest ones were the ones that required students to justify their thinking instead of just what's the correct answer. So rather than asking, what constitutional principle is this, following the question with like, what evidence supports your conclusion? Or could another constitutional principle also apply? So I think those questions require students to explain, defend, and sometimes revise their thinking instead of just, what is it? Well, how do you know that that's it? So I also tried to avoid confirming answers too quickly. So instead of saying that's correct, redirecting the question back to the group. So does everyone agree? Can someone build upon that idea? I think those small instructional moves encourage students to rely more on one another than me. So I think if I can improve something in my questioning, though, it's just increasing my wait time. I think I could do a better job of that. I think there were a few moments where I answered my own question too quickly because maybe I was conscious of time. So giving students another 5 or 10 seconds to think, I think could give richer responses.
I noticed that as well. I think it's kind of a common thing when we start feeling time crunch to start lowering that wait time. And then also sometimes, you get to the point where it feels like there's too many crickets in the room. And so you worry that they didn't get it. But I think we can agree that when you allowed the students to have that additional processing time, that like the conversations in your class were much deeper
Mhm.
and much more focused on like that why piece and that application piece. Um, so going back to looking at your lessons differentiation, how did you address the diverse needs of your learners today?
Yeah, so differentiation was embedded throughout the lesson rather than like existing as a separate activity. So students who benefit from, those supports like guided notes, vocabulary scaffolds, um, highlighted constitutional experts, sentence stems, they have all those things available during their discussion. During station rotations, I intentionally spent additional time checking in with those students, asking scaffold questions that help move their thinking forward without lowering the rigor of the task, while also students demonstrating that mastery have, some sort of extension questions. So I did have one group finish early, so I asked them to compare the constitutional principles they had studied to a Supreme Court decision that they remembered from current events. That extension required them to like synthesize multiple ideas rather than complete additional work. And so I think differentiation works best when everyone is pursuing the same learning but receiving different levels of support to reach it.
Okay. I applaud your effort to keep like that rigor still there because I know a lot of times people think that differentiation means lowering the bar instead of just building a ladder. And so I truly appreciate your focus on that. That being said, were there any students that may need additional intervention after today's lesson?
Yes. So I had a few students whose exit tickets showed that they understand the vocabulary, but they struggle with distinguishing between similar constitutional concepts. So rather than doing like an entire reteach, I want to focus specifically on the misconceptions using graphic organizers, scaffolds, or additional practice scenarios. While those who have shown mastery, I want them to go into analyzing landmark Supreme Court cases that illustrate multiple constitutional principles working together. That way, every student is like continuing to grow from where they currently are.
I think that's a great plan, especially because it's targeted specifically on student needs and based directly on the items that you have gathered. I kind of shift my focus a little bit. Your lesson we've discussed pretty well in depth, so I kind of want to think and reflect a little bit on your classroom environment. One thing that I really noticed is that your students do feel really comfortable in discussing their ideas. Um, how do you think that the environment that you built with your routines and your relationships helped contribute to that learning? And in thinking through that, is there anything that you would like to adjust, maybe to strengthen or just tweak a little bit for your classroom culture?
I really appreciate you noticing. That's a big compliment because classroom culture is something that I definitely intentionally work to build, especially since like the very first day of school. So before students are willing to engage in those meaningful academic conversations, they have to trust that their ideas will be respected. And so I think history often requires students to discuss controversial topics, evaluate different perspectives, and occasionally disagree with one another. And those conversations can only happen productively if students feel safe. And so I think a routine that I do that supports that is greeting students at the door every day. It gives me the opportunity to check in with them individually, establish positive tone before instruction even begins. And then throughout the year, I make it a point that we practice discussion norms. So students understand that disagreement is not only acceptable, we can disagree. It's expected. Nobody has the same thought process. And so, as long as it's respectful and it's grounded in evidence, I think that today I heard students say something to the effect of like, I see your point, but I interpret it differently because I think those types of conversations I want to hear because they demonstrate respectful academic discourse rather than debate for the sake of winning an argument. Like we're really getting down to the core of why I disagree with it using our evidence than it being, well, I just don't like you and I think what you say is wrong. So I think consistency plays a big role in that. Students know what to expect when they enter the room. They know where materials are located, how our transitions work, what productive collaboration looks like. That consistently allows them to spend more time learning and less time like managing our procedures. If I were to, continue to strengthen an aspect of classroom culture, I think it's continuing to increase student ownership of the discussions. I think there's still moments when students look for me for confirmation. And so I think kind of a long-term goal that I would have is for students to rely more on evidence and one another than me to validate every single answer.
I truly, so I like your focus a lot on like that student ownership piece. And I did notice that students are very comfortable taking risks, even if they're not entirely sure they're correct, because I think that's one of the struggles of most humanities is that a lot of it is not always a concrete right or wrong answer. And a lot of students' brains immediately are always like, tell me I'm right. So in saying that, I think that's a good indicator that your kids are, trusting each other and they're trusting you and the environment that you've created.
I'd agree. I think I'd rather have a student like confidently explain an incorrect answer than, quietly avoid participating. So I think those moments often create the best learning opportunities because misconceptions become visible and then we can address them together. And it's also signs of learning.
Yeah. So let's talk about your formative assessment. What evidence did you gather and how are you going to use it to inform your next steps?
So I collected evidence throughout the lesson rather than just, solely my exit ticket. So during the station rotations, I had my clipboard with me where I documented, common misconceptions, participation patterns that I was noticing, as well as notable student responses. I paid close attention to conversations I heard because student dialogue often reveals kind of a deeper level of understanding. So one trend I noticed was that students consistently understood federalism and limited government, but several groups confused separation of power and checks and balances. So that misconception also appeared on several exit tickets. And so because I identified that pattern using our formative assessments, tomorrow's lesson is going to begin with a brief retrieval activity where students compare and contrast those two principles using examples rather than just the definitions. So instead of reteaching the entire lesson, just focusing specifically on the concept that students found most challenging. Our exit ticket also identified students who are ready for enrichment. And so they're going to get to, again, extend, analyze the Supreme Court case, and then explain how multiple constitutional, principles interact. So I think using the assessment in this way helps ensure that instruction remains responsive rather than like predetermined.
I appreciate and one of the strengths that you have as a teacher is your circulation of the classroom and continuously asking those probing questions instead of just checking answers. So that being said, as we wrap up today, let's think about like your professional growth and some goal setting based on today's lesson and our conversations. What's one instructional goal that you'd like to focus on for your next observation or before your next observation?
That's a good question. I don't think that any lesson is ever perfect. So if I was to teach this again tomorrow, I think slowing down transition between the station activities. So, kind of in my own reflection, I realized I spent a little bit more time than necessary reviewing vocabulary during the mini lesson. So that kind of compressed the amount of discussion time students had at the final station. And I think that they would have benefited from maybe another 5 minutes of those collaborative analysis. I also think I would have incorporated maybe one additional visual organizer comparing separation of powers and checks and balances before students began independent application. Even though most students eventually understood this distinction, I think providing that visual scaffold earlier might have prevented some of the confusion that I observed throughout my lesson. And then I think just always evolving my questioning. I noticed several moments when I, unintentionally stepped in to clarify students' thinking maybe a little too quick. So I think just looking back, students were capable of working through those ideas if I had simply allowed more wait time. So there's small adjustments, but I think they would improve an already solid lesson.
So then, if those are your reflections, which what is a way that we can going down to goal setting?
Mm-hmm.
What is a goal that we can use to improve upon that and focus on before your next observation?
Yeah, I think, my next professional goal, I think, would be to increase the level of student-led discourse. I think that's kind of a main focus I have. So over the past year, I think I've really intentionally shifted from being the primary source of information towards more facilitating that learning. And I think today's lesson did, reflect upon that growth. But I still see opportunities to release even more responsibility back to the students. So I think I would like to see students begin facilitating portion of classroom discussions, asking one another more probing questions, and then using that evidence to resolve disagreements before looking towards me. I think that kind of aligns with my broader kind of educational philosophy that students should be doing the majority of the cognitive work and the thinking in my classroom. So I think just becoming more intentional about incorporating structured academic discussion protocols that ensure every student has an opportunity to contribute. I think that would strengthen both engagement and the equity during the collaborative learning.
I like how your answer also ties back to what you just said about if you were to teach the lesson tomorrow, because you identified some small adjustments in questioning. I think honestly that's an excellent professional goal. One thing that I observed today that is an absolute strength is your willingness to let the kids actually struggle productively instead of immediately running in to save them, even though that can be really uncomfortable as a teacher. And so your goal of continuing to expand that student ownership really does seem like a natural next step, and it really feeds into both our district and our school wide goal of increasing student ownership of learning. To support you, I'd be happy to schedule some time for you to visit other classrooms, or we could work and plan together before your next observation. Would either of those be helpful?
Yeah, I would really like the opportunity, to go see effective instructional strategies in action. I think when observing other teachers, it gives me additional ideas for increasing those student-led discussions in my own classroom. I'd also appreciate feedback specifically focused on my questioning techniques during my next observation. I think sometimes it's difficult to recognize when I've maybe stepped in too early, and an outside perspective I think can help me kind of continue to refine and build upon that skill.
I'll definitely write that. observation. Um, I really just want to say thank you very much for going through this process and being as reflective as you are. I truly enjoyed my time in your classroom, and if there's anything I can do to support you going further, please feel free to let me know.
Alrighty. Well, I appreciate the collaboration and the support. It really meant a lot to me.
I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.